What a fantastic presentation this man gives. He travels all over the country. You will know why we're so big on Mr. Brielt and his website. In fact, his home base is shroudencounter.com. With that, let's bring him on, Mr. Russ Brielt.
It's my pleasure to be here with you. In 1978, you had a team of almost 40 American scientists go to Turin, Italy, to analyze a religious artifact. This thing has been known as the Shroud of Turin, the Holy Shroud, the Sacred Shroud. And these scientists, amazingly, got permission to analyze this cloth for 5 days, round the clock, 122 hours, all kinds of gear. And this is making all kinds of news. There's lots of, about every couple months it seems like there was a news article coming out about it. And then in June of 1980, National Geographic came out with a big article about it, and I was hooked. I mean, I have all this information in my head, and I'm just saying to myself, this is an astonishing mystery, and yet at the same time, very few people know anything about it. And then in 1981, I attended the first United States Scientific Symposium on the Shroud in New London, Connecticut, was held at Connecticut College. I attended that 2-day conference, had a chance to meet all the scientists, the historians, the archaeologists, and that's where I kind of got connected, and I've been involved ever since.
Tell us about the Shroud, because a lot of people are so curious as to, they've got many questions.
Yeah, I think the first thing that people want to know is what is the Shroud, and, why is it called the Shroud of Turin? Well, obviously, a shroud is a burial shroud, a shroud that has wrapped a corpse, and they've been using burial shrouds for thousands of years, still do in many cultures in the Middle East and other locations. And so you have this alleged burial shroud that bears the faint image of a bearded, crucified man. And it's been there since 1578, thinking that this cloth is the actual burial shroud that wrapped Jesus when he was in the tomb. Here we are, we live in a skeptical age, we live in a scientific age, and we scratch our heads and we say, really? Is that even remotely possible that the burial shroud of Jesus still exists and sitting in a medium-sized cathedral today in northern Italy? The subtitle is CSI Jerusalem, the case of the missing body. No one ever contested the empty tomb. All they ever said was that someone had stolen the body. Of course, later on, people alleged that Jesus didn't die at all, that he survived the ordeal and hooked up with Mary Magdalene and moved to the south of France, which, of course, we know all is nonsense. But what if he did indeed rise from the dead on the third day, as Christians believe? Does this cloth provide clues as to what happened to the missing body? And so from that standpoint, it truly is a CSI investigation. If you were to drill down a little bit further into Jewish burial practices, you would find that if you were to die by normal means, you actually would be given 3 articles of grave clothes. When you die by violent death with a significant loss of blood, there is no washing of the body, because for the Jew, life is in the blood. You don't wash the body because then you're washing the life away. In the event of violent death, you simply wrap the body in a single linen shroud, and the body will be in the ground or in the tomb that day. And that's Jewish tradition then, and it is now. And of course, with the Shroud of Turin, we have a single linen shroud, and it's obviously this man died a horrific death. There's blood all over it, and yet he's naked. Now, why naked? Well, what did they cast lots for? What did they gamble for? His clothes? From the standpoint of Jewish burial practices, there's nothing that would suggest that the shroud could not be an authentic burial shroud. One legitimate objection, if you would, is that certainly the Scripture mentions a burial shroud, mentions that Joseph of Arimathea is the man who purchased the linen shroud, which Jesus would be wrapped. There is kind of a glaring omission in Scriptures, which is the Scripture doesn't mention images on a linen shroud, kind of a point for the opposition, if you would. But I think it would be instructive to ask this question then, because not everything is recorded in Scripture. How far back in time does the idea or the concept of Jesus' image on his linen shroud, how far back in time does that go? There's something called the Mozarabic Rite of Holy Week. This is a group of Arab Catholics that immigrated to Spain in the 6th century. And they translate John 19:40 this way. So, normally you'd read, say, Peter and John ran to the tomb and saw the linen cloth lying there. That's how we'd normally read that translation. They translate it this way. Peter and John ran to the tomb and saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. That's phenomenal. That's 1,500 years old. Now, the question is, does it go all the way back to the first century? And I don't know. But I do know this, that the very first piece of evidence to Peter and John that something extraordinary had happened in that tomb is specifically related to the burial shroud. Go through the biblical narratives. Mary goes to the tomb. She sees that the body's gone, and her first reaction is someone has taken or stolen the body. She runs and finds Simon, Peter, and John and tells them that. So they run back down to the tomb. There they stoop down, go inside that tomb, and see the linen cloth lying there and believed that something extraordinary had occurred. And some translations believe that he had risen. If the body was stolen, then why would you unwrap a corpse? Oh, my gosh. Something specific to the linen shroud was the first piece of evidence that Jesus had risen from the dead. And was it images on that cloth? I have no idea. The tradition of Jesus' image on his linen shroud, that tradition goes back 1,500 years. But I don't know if it goes back to first century.
If he would have been able to work himself out of this burial cloth, it certainly would not have the pristine appearance or the image that we are familiar with.
I would agree with that totally. There doesn't appear to be any evidence that the cloth was removed from the body. Is that the body just disappeared. But anyways, we can tell the difference between blood that flowed before death and after death. Either the Shroud of Turin is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus, or it's not. And if it's not, then it must be the work of an artist. And if that's the case, then there must be some kind of substances on the cloth to account for the image, some kind of paint, ink, dye, pigmentation, stain. We must be able to determine some kind of process by which this image was created, if in fact it's man-made. All the tests that were done on the shroud in 78 show that there's no visible trace of any kind of paint, ink, dye, pigmentation, or stain. There are no artistic substances on the cloth to account for the image. Now, I can talk about the chemistry of why the image appears, but it's not because of any substances applied to the cloth by some, alleged medieval artist. So you have an image that doesn't appear to be the work of an artist, is not made or constituted from any substances, and you have a whole pattern of bloodstains that seems to be from a corpse. You say, well, this is beginning to sound like maybe this cloth could be authentic. In the investigation of the shroud, you have to look at the shroud as a textile. And if you were to analyze the cloth, you would quickly see that it's a very distinctive 3-to-1 herringbone pattern twill weave. The individual threads are hand-spun. The whole bleaching effect that we see on the cloth, all of this suggests that it's predates the Middle Ages. But this weave, we've found examples of 3-to-1 pattern weave in silk and wool from 1st century, even going all the way back to 9th century BC. But we have not found it in flax linen. And now that doesn't mean they didn't do it. It just means it's expensive. It's very expensive, and it's very rare. In fact, everything about the manufacture of the cloth would indicate that this is probably one of the most, expensive pieces of linen that you could buy at the time. Now, this is an interesting clue, because the Scripture says Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, purchased a fine linen cloth, and all the high priests, they were all commanded that when they went into the Holy of Holies to make the annual sacrifice and put on clothes made of fine, twisted linen. Now, fine, twisted linen, the Scripture tells you, represents the holiness of God. This linen thing is significant. So who was Joseph? Now, Joseph, he was a Pharisee. He was attached to the temple. That when Joseph of Arimathea He knew who Jesus was. When he purchased linen to wrap Jesus, he purposely purchased linen that was worthy of a high priest about to enter the Holy of Holies. That's why the Shroud of Turin, as we analyze it today, is this very fine 3-to-1 herringbone pattern twill weave. I think Joseph has sent us a big clue. He's mentioned in all 4 Gospels. When you look at the shroud, you have to realize the shroud is unlike anything else that we know in the realm of art, in that you have a front and back image, frontal and dorsal image of approximately a 5'10", apparently crucified man. When you look at the shroud, you see the burns, you see the blood stains, you see the water stains, and of course you see the image. But if you turn the cloth over, you'd see the burns, you'd see the water stains, you'd see the blood stains, but you would not see the image of the man, because the image of the man appears only on the top 2 microfibers of the linen cloth facing the body. Each individual thread is made up of about 200 microfibers. This image resides on approximately the top 1 or 2 microfibers, which means less than 1% of a single thread. If you were to take a razor blade and shave the surface of the cloth, the image would disappear. This extreme superficiality of the image is just one of the phenomenal attributes of it, because now you say, well, my goodness, what artist could have come up with this as a process in the Middle Ages? All right, fine. If it's not authentic, then it must be the work of an artist. Now we're trying to say, well, then how did the artist come up with it? One of the scientists once said, it would be a greater miracle if it was the work of an artist. Nothing else like it in the realm of art. There's no style to this, and there's nothing else like it before it or after it, which kind of runs contrary to the whole notion of it being art. The other thing that is very, very intriguing about the shroud is that the shroud contains distance information. Some of your audience who have known a little bit about the shroud know that it has this kind of 3D nature to it. Ray Downing, he's a 3D animator, and he's using state-of-the-art technology, showing how he's literally able to extract from a 2-dimensional surface a 3-dimensional relief, because the information is there. Because what we see, remember these individual microfibers that are affected by whatever caused the image, what we have is what's called a pixelization effect, which means that the cloth was to the body, the darker the image. The farther from the body, the lighter the image, up to about 4 centimeters. So basically what you have is in areas where the cloth may have been separated from the body by a millimeter or a centimeter, you simply have fewer of those individual microfibers are affected by what caused the image. So literally you have distance information encoded into the shroud, much like a topographical map. So this is one of the great mysteries of the shroud, and how did this get there? The image appears on the cloth because of literally a discoloration of the cloth, with something having interacted with what we believe is a carbohydrate layer, like a sugar compound carbohydrate layer, and this is less than 1/100th the diameter of a human hair. You would not be able to see it to the natural eye, but something has interacted with this carbohydrate layer to bring about a discoloration of the cloth, but only in those areas immediately surrounding the body. So again, not because of any substances applied to it. Now, what actually brought about this discoloration, that is the ultimate question. Was it some kind of artistic process, or are we talking about the resurrection here? Here's the bottom line. Even if we could reverse engineer it completely, that still doesn't prove that it's a work of a medieval artist. Having said that, one of the things that causes me to remain interested in the shroud is that either this cloth is the most phenomenal fraud ever perpetrated, or it's the most important artifact on the planet. What keeps me going is the message. The message of the shroud is identical to Scripture. There's no difference. None. Zero. Still do in many cultures in the Middle East and other locations. And so you have this alleged burial shroud that bears the faint image of a bearded, crucified man. And it's been there since 1578, thinking that this cloth is the actual burial shroud that wrapped Jesus when he was in the tomb. Here we are, we live in a skeptical age, we live in a scientific age, and we scratch our heads and we say, really? Is that even...
What a fantastic presentation this man gives. He travels all over the country. You will know why we're so big on Mr. Briault and his website. In fact, his home base is shroudencounter.com. With that, let's bring him on, Mr. Russ Briault.
It's my pleasure to be here with you. In 1978, you had a team of almost 40 American scientists go to Turin, Italy, to analyze. The National Geographic came out with a big article about it, and I was hooked. I mean, I have all this information in my head, and I'm just saying to myself, this is an astonishing mystery, and yet at the same time, very few people know anything about it. And then in 1981, I attended the first United States Scientific Symposium on the Shroud in New London, Connecticut. It was held at Connecticut College. I attended that two-day conference, had a chance to meet all the scientists, the historians, the archaeologists, and that's where I kind of got connected, and I've been involved ever since.
Tell us about the shroud, because a lot of people are so curious as to, they've got many questions.
Yeah, I think the first thing that people want to know is what is the shroud, and, why is it called the Shroud of Turin? Well, obviously, a shroud is a burial shroud, a shroud that has wrapped a corpse, and they've been using burial shrouds for thousands of years, a religious artifact. This thing has been known as the Shroud of Turin, the Holy Shroud, the Sacred Shroud, and these scientists amazingly got permission to analyze this cloth for 5 days, round the clock, 122 hours, all kinds of gear. And this is making all kinds of news. There's lots of, about every couple months it seems like there was a news article coming out about it. And then in June of 1980,